Welcome everyone to this webinar on the top 10 reasons why supplier pre-qualification fails. My name is Owen West. I'm the Managing Director of Browse Australia, and it's my pleasure to be the facilitator for this webinar. Just in terms of my background, I've been CPO of companies both in mining and electricity utilities industries. I've also done work in government and service industries and have managed several procurement organisational improvement projects, including some supplier pre-qualification implementations. I've both got general management experience in large and small organisations and also have some international experience across Australia, Asia, UK and the US. I'm delighted to be joined today with Bill Nikoff, who is the Director of Professional Services for Browse. Bill's an industry expert in areas of supplier qualification and health and safety. Before coming to Browse, Bill has 3 years' experience in health and safety at Caterpillar. In 2008, he led a multi-functional team that benchmarked 13 Fortune 500 companies and used this data to develop Caterpillar's level contractor safety management process. He then served as corporate process owner for contractor management, safety management for the next 3 years. During this time, he led the implementation of Browse at Caterpillar manufacturing facilities located in the US, UK, Germany and India. Over the past 5 years, many global companies have benchmarked the process that Bill developed for Caterpillar, and so given this experience, Bill has very relevant knowledge of this evolving industry and what it takes to design and implement a supplier management process that will work and provide real value to a company, whether it be a small family-owned business or a highly successful global operation. One last thing from me before I hand over to Bill is that you'll notice on your screens that you've got a button for questions. There will be time for question and answers at the end of the forum. The webinar in total will take approximately 50 minutes, and we'll certainly leave about 10 minutes or so for questions at the end. So please type in your questions into the free text area, and so I ask that you please ensure that you include the question so that and press the button to all panelists so that the questions are distributed to all presenters. If you don't get a chance to answer your questions at the end, we'll certainly follow up with you later on. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to Jill, who'll come through the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We appreciate your participation in this webinar. We hope that you get some benefit and some useful information out of this. And again, when we get to the end of the presentation, Owen and I will hopefully work together to be able to answer your questions. And again, if we're not able to, we simply run out of time, we'll try to get the answers and get back to you after the meeting. So without that, I'm going to jump right into the presentation. Again, titled the Top 10 Reasons Why Supplier Qualification Fails. We're really going to address this both from the failure side and the ways to make sure you don't fail. So I'm going to give you both the negative and the positive side to it. So the first one, one of the questions is why do we even bother to qualify the supply chain? And I think probably the number one reason, the biggest reason most people are interested in doing that, most companies are interested in doing that, is simply to identify and to control risk. It's hard to run a business if you're not aware, you can't identify the risks that are out there and put together a proper plan to control or mitigate those risks. And so it's critically important to being a successful business. And that risk can come from really a multitude of different sources. When we talk about supplier pre-qualification, probably the first thing that comes to mind is EH&S or safety and health related type risk, and that clearly is vitally important. but it's not the only risk that's out there either. There are a lot of other risks that suppliers could introduce into your business. Those could include things like financial risks, legal risks. There's just a lot of things out there. If you're bringing people onto your property or work sites that you manage the work at, there's the potential, to introduce a lot of risk that maybe you either aren't aware of or aren't prepared to deal with. And so the pre-qualification process will really help you to identify and to control that risk. Another reason is brand protection. I think this is important to everybody, but, if you happen to be working for a national type company or a multinational company where your name is really well known, being able to protect that brand or that image is also critically important. And I don't know, there may be some of the folks that are on the phone that have had the unfortunate opportunity to get some bad press or to be unfairly recognized in the press for something that maybe took place on their site, but maybe it was a supplier. Maybe it was something that was out of the hands of you, the company or the property owner that was really a supplier-related problem, but because your company name is the name that's well known, that's the one that ends up getting splashed across us. So I think, we continue to see more blurring of the line between suppliers and clients, and so the potential, to kind of drag your name through the mud because of something that really wasn't directly involved with you is clearly out there. Staying with this line of reasoning, if you look at the things that are listed here on this slide, I don't typically just talk directly to the slides, but I think this is a really good illustration. If you look at the reliability and the other things listed there for the customers, making sure that you do a good job, contractor supplier pre-qualification, will really help drive and ensure that you're getting good reliability, good service, good price. And those things to the customers are all value added. And so if you're doing a good job of that, you're driving value add to your business, and you're really driving, profit or additions to the bottom line. So being able to control those things and have an impact on them is also impacted by this type of program. It clearly has a positive effect on your business. And then finally, which is kind of doing the same, but shareholder value. In the end, it rolls up to shareholder value. You have the potential, with a well-managed program to reduce costs, things tied to potential downtime due to a supplier incident, legal issues, the costs and things associated with injuries or environmental issues, things like that. So you've got a lot of direct and indirect costs or potential costs tied to those suppliers that are coming onto your property. And so, again, managing a good program like this really gives you a solid footing for controlling or maybe even eliminating those types of costs. So it really does add to shareholder value.
Hey, Bill, could I just interrupt there? I think this is a really highly value-added initiative. From my experience, understanding your supply chain better can add a lot of benefit to outcomes in terms of safety and procurement outcomes. So it's not just about reducing costs or improving efficiencies. It can also make your supply chain outcome much more effective and efficient through just understanding your suppliers better and what their real capabilities are.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thanks for adding that. Excellent. Okay, so I think without further ado, we'll jump into the top 10. I'll say before I go to the first slide or the first element here in the top 10, I did not put these together in any particular order, but I actually do feel that the first element that I have on here, which is the lack of leadership commitment, the other 9 may share somewhat equal billing, but in my mind and my experience in having done this for a long time, this is in my mind clearly the biggest potential failure point for a supplier pre-qualification process. And it really boils down to you have to have leadership commitment. You have to have somebody at an upper level, at whatever, whether it's at a facility level or a company level or a divisional level, whatever that might be, but whoever is ultimately responsible for the performance of that segment of the company, they have to get behind this and champion this, and the only way to really ensure that is to make sure that they clearly see the value behind it. And I think explaining the value initially, at least in my experience, it might seem tough initially, but I think once you think about the things that we're going to talk about here tonight, and you're able to explain those to your leadership team, they're going to see a very clear, I think, prominent value associated with a process like this, and that's going to help ensure the success of the Supplier Qualification program. On the other hand, if you don't get, you can't maintain the leadership commitment, there are very few businesses or companies out there that I know of that are going to support spending time, maybe manpower, resources, money to try to drive a program where they're not getting value out of it. Nobody wants to spend money and not get something back for it. So that, believe me, that comes from the leadership, and they'll make that decision. If something's adding value to their business, they're going to support it, they're going to help it, they're going to, they're going to drive its success. On the other hand, if they either don't believe or can't be convinced there's value there, they'll very quickly lose interest in it, and really that program is probably going to fail. Okay. Another failure point, potential failure point, not understanding internal stakeholder needs, and in fact, really, it's wants and needs and understanding the difference between that. And I think this is kind of a several-part process, and that is, if you're going to initiate a program like this, I think the first step is identifying accurately who are the stakeholders within your company or your business. You know, typically, this type of process, if you're looking at pre-qualifying suppliers, it typically touches multiple sections of your organization. Again, you know, I think probably the first thing people think of a lot of time with this is health and safety, although, stress again, it's not the only area. But your health and safety folks are stakeholders in this, and in fact, they might be the ones that are trying to initiate the process. Supply chain, seeing whatever you call that organization, procurement, they clearly have a big role in this and have to be a key player in it. Therefore, you have to recognize that fact and then understand and differentiate what their wants and their needs are. You have other groups as well. Legal may play in it, your operations folks, that kind of business. It could touch everybody, but that's clearly something that you have to define, and then you have to diligently to find out exactly what it is they need. It's critical that good understanding is there before you start down this process, because if you start working on this process and you don't meet the needs, or in some cases wants, key stakeholders, again, you have the real possibility of the process breaking down. It's a lot of people tied into this, and all of their needs need to be met, or you're going to end up with resistance. And once you start getting resistance, it's kind of a slippery slope to try to overcome that. So a lot of time needs to be put into that. On the flip side of that, if you've done a good job at this and everybody's on board, you'll find that they're all pulling the same direction, all supporting the cause, they're all seeing the value and the benefit that they're getting out of it. You have every chance to have a very successful program.
Actually, Gil, could I just interrupt for a minute again? This is one of the most interesting elements of a successful implementation, because not all parts of the organisation, and particularly not all operational parts of the organisation, are going to have the same needs. It's important to try to implement a system that can accommodate the different needs of different parts of an organisation, so that what might apply in one part of your organisation just might need a slightly different flavour in another part of the organisation. It's not so easy to have a system where one size fits all and expect that everyone's going to be completely happy with that. There's a risk that you might end up with the lowest common denominator solution rather than one that really does meet the key critical needs, and particularly of those operational areas.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Okay. Number 3 on the list is ineffective communication. And when I talk about this, there's really a couple of sides to this as well. And I think you have communication internal to your organization, and then you have external-facing communication with your suppliers and the people that are involved with that. You really have to do a good job, first off, of, as you're gaining leadership commitment, getting stakeholder agreement and support with inside your organization, obviously that's only going to come through communication. And they need to have a clear understanding, again, of what their role is going to be, what the value or the benefit to them is going to be for participating in this, and really what the, if you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, the implementation schedule and how those things are going to roll out. Because if you don't do a very good job of communicating that, the last thing you want is stakeholders to be surprised or be caught off guard, maybe not understand the way something is going to work, or the timing of it or something like that. Again, if you're all in agreement, you all understand, you're all working from the same playbook, it'll make this program that much more successful. And then the same is true for, facing outward toward your suppliers. You don't just want to call them up and say, hey, we're doing this or whatever, and we've got 3 days to meet this requirement. I've been through implementations of this at facilities all over the world, a lot of different cultures, but one thing never changes, and that is you don't take the time to clearly communicate to your supply base what you're doing, why you're doing it, benefits you're hoping to see out of it, and what benefits they might gain out of it, what the time frame is, if there's going to be a cost associated with it. All of those things need to be, you need to be transparent. They need to be communicated up front. They need to be communicated on a regular basis. You need to make sure that as a part of that communication, both internally and externally, that as questions or concerns arise, you're looking to provide, again, value-added solutions or answers to those questions. So it is, just like with any other major change, and this could be a very major change for your company and or your supply chain, with any type of big change like that, if you don't communicate properly as part of a overall change management plan, again, you do run the risk of really having the program fail before it ever gets off the start. Okay, so we've talked about stakeholders, we've talked about communication, we've talked about the fact that this type of program typically touches or involves, multiple arms of your organization. Clearly, when you're talking about your supply chain, suppliers, if you don't have support and buy-in from your internal supply chain folks, you're going to run into problems, and those problems can snowball very quickly. And again, you may find yourself in a situation where the program really may not even get off the ground before you run into some significant problems. There's a lot of potential benefits, though, to your supply chain folks, which, when they understand that, you typically will get full-on support. But there's some things you have to take into consideration. Typically, a program like this is going to have to be integrated in some way into your supply chain processes and functions. The information that goes into this needs to be transparent to those folks that need to have the information. It's possible, depending on the situation at your company and or the desires of your supply chain, and again, if you understand their wants and needs, this is critical. You may be wanting one thing for your supply chain, and your actual procurement folks may be wanting something else. I mean, procurement folks may see a real benefit in using something like this maybe to shrink the supply chain a little bit and cut it down to the critical suppliers that can provide most of the service. And I've seen it just the other way, too. I've seen supply chain folks want to do this in order to expand the availability and recognition of suppliers, that they might need to use in the future. So it's absolutely critical. It's probably going to be tied directly into their processes, and they need to be fully on board, supportive, and in fact, probably adding guidance and help on setting up the process and how you run it.
Yeah, this links really well to your previous point about effective communication. To get that supply chain buy-in, it's really important to communicate to the supply chain the benefits that they'll get from this. Often in tender situations, suppliers are resubmitting information repeatedly. With proper pre-qualification systems, you can choose a number of suppliers who you know are going to be capable of your requirements, and you can cover off the basic capabilities of those suppliers. You don't need to repeatedly submit basic information about the paper. That saves you a lot of time, and also saves the suppliers a lot of time.
Right. Excellent. Okay. This is another one, and again, I've seen multiple examples of this. In fact, to be honest with you, in some respects, we went through this problem when we designed the process for Caterpillar, and that is, as you work through and set up what your requirements are, your standards are, your selection criteria, if you do a whole job at selecting or designing those so that they're either too stringent or they're inappropriate for the type of suppliers that you're working with, what you could find is a situation where, a large portion, maybe even the majority of your supply chain can't meet your requirements, or they simply don't apply to them. And I've seen it firsthand. You're gonna see a lot of heartburn from everybody involved in the process. Supply chain's going to get upset because they can't meet your requirements, and they're worried about their ability to do business with you. Your own procurement folks are probably going to get upset because now all of a sudden they see the possible suppliers shrinking because they can't meet the criteria. The other pieces of your business, whether you're manufacturing or service provider or something like that, same thing. If they can't get the service of their suppliers, they may not have the ability to do whatever part of your business that they're expected to do. And so you have to be very careful. And we talk a lot about crawl, walk, and run in a couple of different venues. This is one of those areas where I think you have to set criteria that clearly provides value to your organization as the client. But you also have to set it, or at least time it in a way where the supply chain can either meet it initially, or most of the supply chain can meet it initially, and then as you mature in your process, you can ramp those requirements up, make them more stringent to try to drive continuous improvement in your supply base. That's one way to do it. If you don't do something like that again, and nobody can meet the requirements, you're going to end up with a significant problem that can cause you to fail. The other thing that you potentially run the risk of is maybe trying to set up a cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all set of requirements, and you may find out that your supply chain doesn't fit into that one category or that one definition, and again, you end up with a supply chain that can't hopefully meet requirements. And so, again, typically it's companies intending to do the best thing and to get the best suppliers and to get the most value out of this process, but you do have to be careful that you don't set the bar so high that nobody can clear that and put your business at risk. Okay, now we kind of get into this tends to be one of the frictional points usually within your own organization and potentially with the suppliers as well, and that is if a true potential failure point is the enforcement piece of this. If you're going to go through the process of developing a supplier qualification process, you're going to require your suppliers to go through that process. You're going to modify your procurement processes. You go through all of these things, and then if you're not willing or don't have the enforcement piece built into your process, your system, again, this is another significant potential failure point. If the program doesn't have teeth in it internally, the people within your organization quickly figure out, this guy's not following the process, but he's still able to get whatever supplier he wants, whether they meet our criteria or not. That word will spread like wildfire through the organization, and pretty soon nobody will be following the process. And then you've got time and resources and money invested in this, and you've got suppliers vested in this, and the system's not working. And you also open yourself up to, I think, a question of your business integrity if you don't enforce the rules. If you're, regardless of how simple or complex they are, once you set those requirements and you drive this process, if you allow, you don't enforce it, you allow it to, bypassed, sidestepped, or whatever, you may get the view, and it can be very outspoken, in fact, that the supply chain, you're pushing us to go through this process. You've told us this, this, and this, and now we know there are other suppliers that you're not enforcing the rules on. And that's a big negative, because we talk a lot about, if you run suppliers through this type of process, you're basically leveling the playing field. People are being compared and measured, to the same set of requirements. And if you let that slip, your business integrity, I think, comes into question. And it's the same thing on the external side. Suppliers will talk. You've got internal problems potentially if you don't enforce it. It's the same thing external. I actually saw a case of what I would call supplier mutiny, where suppliers that had gone through the qualification process and did not meet those requirements were allowed to continue to bid on and earn new business. Well, again, typically those suppliers, especially if they're contractor types, they talk, because a lot of them work on the same projects, and it gets around that, hey, you're really not enforcing this. And if that's the case, you're going to get a lot of kickback, because suppliers are going to say, well, why am I going through the actions and the hoops that you're asking me to go through, and if there's a cost associated with it, why am I paying this cost if you're not going to enforce it to begin with? So it's critical that you do have an enforcement piece of this.
So I think there's a really interesting alternative viewpoint about enforcement. You're absolutely right that there must be enforcement so that people only use the right suppliers for the goods and services that they need. But interestingly, this can actually be very liberating for the operational side of the business. While the standards may be set by procurement or safety or other stakeholders, by setting those standards and then pre-qualifying suppliers for use by the operations are then free to go and use those suppliers and place orders with them. It can actually be quite liberating for those operators to then work within those standards. And if you like, it can be the implementation of like a centre-led procurement, centre-led safety standards, which allows the operational part of the business to get on and do what they really need to do without undue interference.
Exactly. Yeah, good point. Supplier refusal. Again, I've seen experience and had experience with this. The limited or spotty refusal of a supplier to, participate or work through your qualification process, onesies and twosies, I guess, in and of themselves may not cause a failure of the overall process, but it does have the potential. And typically what we see with this, refusing to follow the process, a couple of different reasons. A lot of times they simply don't understand what I'll call the cost-benefit ratio. They typically see this as a cost, extra work that they have to do, and they don't particularly feel, in some cases, that they're getting value benefit out of it. So they may just say, I'm not going to do this because I don't see any value to me. I've also seen suppliers refuse to participate if the process that you've designed is so cumbersome, they don't feel it's worth the effort. And again, as we talked just a few moments ago, if there's a set of rules out there that either they know they can't meet, or they know is going to be a real struggle, get to that point, and perhaps they don't want to put the effort in to do that, they may refuse to participate in the program for those reasons as well. So there's a couple of things out there. You may even have contractors or suppliers start through the process, and perhaps they feel they're just not being treated well or communicated to enough, not getting enough help or feedback from you or if you use a third-party provider to do that service. Again, they may kind of sour on the whole thing and say, we're not going to do this. We'll find business somewhere else. We don't have to go through this pre-qualification process. So it's really important that when you do run into resistance from your suppliers, you take the time to explain to them, again, the value and the benefits to both them and to your company. This is something that has changed rapidly, in my opinion, over the last 7 or 8 years, and again, it is a clear potential for a qualification program. I remember when we started doing this on a limited basis at CAT, we were managing things with homemade spreadsheets or databases. We were tracking things in paper files and things like that. Quickly found that it wasn't efficient at all. There was a lot of chance for error, time-consuming. It wasn't necessarily repeatable or reproducible at multiple locations. It just caused a lot of problem and you quickly grew tired of it. And again, it can quickly lead to a failure. And so using, I would say, I don't want to say modern, get down bad, but more sophisticated technologies that simplify the process, that streamline the process, that make it simple and easy, that make the information available to a large number of people by clicking on a website. Those are the type of things that will really add value and ease to this, really help to make it a successful program.
Yeah, Gil, I think this is one of the questions people often ask is, if I'm implementing a pre-qualification process to my standard, why should I use a third-party provider? And the question is around that technology question. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to keep information up to date, and it is necessary to use a third-party provider to do that, and to do that to the standard that you require from your organisation. This simply can't be a
right. Perfect segue into the next slide, Owen. That is, a lot of times companies will get into this. They'll recognize that it's the right thing to do, that it's value-added, it's a good thing to do. But one of the things that, again, I've seen this firsthand, that companies will struggle with is that they simply underestimate the type of resources or administrative support that they need to run a program like this. And again, if you look at a well-developed pre-qualification process and maybe a more advanced one where you're looking at a multitude of things, ranging from health and safety performance to, the financial security of the business and things like that, it takes multiple levels or areas of expertise. It takes, again, sophisticated systems and things like that to stay ahead of it and to manage it properly. And I think a lot of companies will get their eyes open when they start down this process and they really get into managing it and they realize, they're potentially totally understaffed to manage a process like this. We actually ran a specific, when I was at Caterpillar setting this up, we ran a specific Six Sigma project to try to determine just for our U.S. facilities how many resources we would need to manage a process like this in-house, again, just for our U.S. facilities. We came back with a range of 13 to 15 full-time employees that were doing nothing but managing our contractor safety management process for us. When you start looking at the expertise required and or the potential training that might go along with that and the costs associated with that type of headcount, it can quickly become cost prohibitive and very surprising, I guess, until you really get into it. And so it is, again, your eyes open and understand if you were to be successful at this, you've got to have dedicated resources that are both qualified to do it and have enough resources to make it successful. And then I think our last one, I believe this is number 10, I've lost track. It's important to recognize, I think if you're going to be successful with this, you have to understand going into it that it's not a one-time type of event. It's not a static compliance event. In other words, you're not going to be successful for very long if you go out and you run your suppliers through a qualification event or something like that, and then just assume that they're going to continue to meet your requirements and stay up to date or current with whatever those requirements are. If you don't continue to monitor and verify that, things can change in a day, and I've seen it happen. And so you have to go into this thinking, this is going to be a continuous process, which you should be thinking, that's what we want. Because if you've got a continuous process, you have the ability, every ability, to make it a continuous improvement process. And as you work through this, and you work through it with your supply chain, clearly communicating to them that it's not a one-time event, again, be totally transparent, and I think everybody will see and get the value out of it.
More there, Gil, it's often changes, probably the most frequent change in a supplier organisation that causes them to become non-compliant is a change of staff, change of personnel. Someone who's very passionate, for example, about safety, they leave the organisation and standards can very quickly change. It's very important to keep supply capability information right up to date.
So this kind of brings us to our last slide, and I think I'll hand this back over to Owen here, but I'll come back and just kind of to summarize this whole thing up. You have to be able to show that this is going to provide value. And I think if you look into this, decide what you want to do, you can clearly show that this adds value. And as you start down this process, again, I talked about setting realistic requirements or criteria, standards, whatever you choose to call them. You need to look at that and have that continuous process improvement thinking in the back of your mind. Because as you go through this, one of the things that you'll probably see, which I think we have good historical data to back this up, is that your supply chain will improve. As you work them through this process, they'll improve, procurement processes will improve, you'll start adding value and benefit to the bottom line. And if you're, again, serious and you're doing a good job at maintaining this, you're just going to continue to drive it. And by doing that, you're going to continue to add value to the bottom line. And so it truly is a value-added process as long as you don't really fall into some of the pitfalls that we just discussed there this evening. Anything to add to that?
I think that's a very valid comment on the pre-qualification process is a very multidisciplinary approach. The range of question sets can be right across a whole raft of supplier disciplines. Supply capabilities is appropriate for different parts of the organisation. So it is a complete management system approach. So that really, we've gone through the 10 reasons, and I hope you've gotten something out of that, and really hope you've gotten some questions up in your mind after hearing this information. I flipped up this last slide so that you can use it as a reference, but these are what we call the top 10 reasons that we just discussed. So you've got them there for your reference. I think at this point we can open up the microphones or whatever and hopefully put questions for you. Yeah, thanks, Gil. We do have some questions that have come in. And in fact, I'll direct the first one to you, if you don't mind. It's what other areas do you suggest beyond safety?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've got a lot of different areas that could provide potential value. And they would range anything from also looking at monitoring, tracking, verifying insurance information, legal information as well. You can look at, I think I mentioned earlier in the presentation, measuring and monitoring financial performance of the suppliers that you're using. Business continuity plans are things that are vitally important. If you have key suppliers that are, a key support to your organization, you probably want to know that they have a sound business continuity plan so that if there's a problem, you don't suffer the repercussions of that. You can also look at things like diversity, maybe quality systems. Corporate responsibility is something that's getting more and more common and part of the pre-qualification, menu, and sustainability as well.
Thanks, Phil. I do have some other questions, but I'd just like to emphasise to listeners that if you'd like to chat, rather than us plough through the questions that have been written in, which we can respond to later, if you'd like to press the chat button, please don't hesitate to do so, and we can start a dialogue about any particular issue that you wish to cover in more detail. But while you think about that, let me just go on to the next question. This seems like a large initiative. How can I plan my administrative resources to support the process? How many full-time employees do I need? Well, let's have a go at this first. You're certainly right that it is a very large initiative. A lot of change management is involved because a pre-qualification process can cut across many departments of an organisation, and it can mean some change in procedures. On the whole, all of those procedural changes are very, very positive for the organisation. It is important to put a lot of resource into making sure that this goes smoothly and all of the issues are covered, particularly when you mentioned communication. Communication is particularly important. When you use a third-party provider to do this, the sort of support that you can expect from them is to have a resource sort of per 500 or more suppliers to help with that pre-qualification process. So you should expect to receive a lot of support from your third-party provider, not only in the initial stages of change management, but as the program continues, that support is provided not only to your own organisation, but also to the supplier group.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's hard. It's probably hard to put a number to that and kind of say this. You need this many people to manage this many contractors, because I think it will clearly depend on how, I don't want this to sound negative, but how complex or how involved your pre-qualification program is. If you have a very simple set of requirements, very few documents or whatever that you need to do or verify, or very few things, pieces of information that you want to gather, obviously that's going to take you less resources than if you're, if you're going to do a complex, involved, bigger type of program. And that's also something to keep in mind as you move forward. You may decide that you want to, you want to follow the crawl, walk, run model. You may have the resources to live through or to be successful with your crawl model, but as you step up, you still have the resources available and you get the resources to do that. And that is, to be honest, when we, and I don't want to sound like a Caterpillar broken record, but when I went through this with Caterpillar, that was what we did with a lot of our benchmarking. We looked at a lot of companies that were already doing qualification and contractor safety management. We looked at the size of their organizations. We looked at the complexity of the qualification process, and then we compared that to what we wanted. And again, when we saw the scope of what we really thought we needed to do to get value out of it, we just didn't think we couldn't provide that level of resource. So for us, it was a clear decision for us that we needed to find a third-party expert in this area.
Thanks, Pete. the next question I find personally very interesting. I hear all this. I'm in procurement. I don't want to give up higher authority. And I think that's a very valid question. Procurement departments traditionally are the ones who do an internal pre-qualification process. Look, I really don't think that it does involve giving up authority, because procurement are one of the key stakeholders in setting standards for pre-qualification. And once those standards are set, it's the procurement managers who do recognise which suppliers are being used, which are not being used. And as I mentioned before, that can be a very powerful centre-led procurement process, so the operational guys can then get on and do what they need to do, but they're operating within standards that are set by procurement. So I've been through that. I can well understand the concerns of procurement that they lose influencing ability. So I think, in fact, the reverse is true, that these sorts of processes can really give authority to a procurement organisation and indeed a safety organisation to set standards and then to ensure that they're actually being met across the organisation.
That's a good answer. That's a very good answer. I don't know, you guys must be maybe a shy or a quiet group, but I haven't heard anybody speak up on the phone yet. We have gotten quite a few questions submitted electronically, but any questions anybody wants to bring up and speak out loud on the phone? Well, I encourage you to do that. Okay, only chat. Okay, that's why I apologize. That's why I'm not hearing anybody speak up. Okay, I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions.
Okay. Actually, this one is, has been directed actually to Browse, and we shouldn't really do that. But it says you're collecting compliance information. So what can we do beyond? We should talk generally about these systems. What you just start?
Yeah, go ahead. You break the ice on that one.
Most of my experience of these pre-qualification systems, they are broader than just questionnaires about suppliers and collecting information. Because the real value of some of these systems is it can then link through to not only ensuring that you're using the right supplier, but using the right employees from the right supplier. So, for example, you can implement what Browse calls employee level management, so that employee certificates can be managed, so expiry dates, for example, if you need licenses for particular employees, training centres can be implemented, time and attendance and gate access systems can be implemented as well, and other providers will provide similar services beyond just the collection of supplier data. But the real value of those systems is having that comprehensive service that ensures that we're not just superficially asking questions about a supplier, but ensuring that the supply chain provides a real benefit through that. And I should add to that, of course, also audits. What we want to do is not only ensure that suppliers are providing the right information, but they're being audited. And you can set whatever level of audits you want. You can have desktop audits or office-based audits to ensure that the information being provided is validated.
Very good. Yeah, I agree.
Look, I think we've just about run out of time because we did promise that we wouldn't go over 50 minutes. If you do have questions that we haven't been able to answer, please don't hesitate to email them in. The contact details will have been on your invitation. So, as I say, please don't hesitate to make further contact if you need to. The webinar will be on the net, so if you'd like to listen again or to pass on the information to others, please don't hesitate to do that. So thank you very much for attending. Really appreciate the time that you've given to us for this, and I do trust you've gained some valuable information and insights. Thank you, Gil, for your your input. That's been really helpful.
Yeah, same to you, Owen. It's always nice to have a couple of people that are involved with this because you get different viewpoints and different experiences and that. And I think clearly, as we walked through this, Owen and I were able to speak to, real-world examples and things that we've seen in that. And so, again, we've lived it, we've done it, we've worked through this. So I hope you were able to learn from it and get some value out of it.
Okay, thank you all.
Thanks.